name is John Whitehurst. I'm a reference archivist here at the Georgia Archives. And so I'll go ahead and introduce our last speaker here. Joe Cook is a writer, a photographer, and river conservationist who has explored and documented Georgia's waterways for nearly 3 decades. A former executive director and riverkeeper for the Coosa River Basin Initiative, he now coordinates Paddle Georgia for the Georgia River Network. He's the author of Georgia River Network's User Guide series and co-author of several natural history books.
Thank you. All right. I know y'all getting towards the end of the day. I know whenever I go to a conference like the last one, everybody's just like, oh, let's get out of here. But I will try to keep you entertained and informed these last few minutes of this program. I appreciate y'all having to invite me to come and speak to y'all. My friend Kit Carson came up from Macon. He is a Paddle Georgia participant. Our Georgia Rivers does paddle trips all over the state, but we do a week-long paddle trip each summer called Paddle Georgia. We've been doing it for 20 years. We have about 300 people that participate in that week-long trip each summer. And it's loads of fun. And that project has kind of led to those guidebooks and has led me to do the research that I do on Georgia's rivers. One of the things that we do on our paddle trips is we tell jokes about animals that live in our rivers. So I'm going to start out with some jokes about river animals. If any of y'all ever, and Kit's going, oh no, oh. Any of y'all heard of the darters? Little fish in our rivers called darters. There's lots of different kinds of darters, and they all have fun names. You know, Etowah darter, Cherokee darter, Halloween darter. That was our joke animal one year, the darter. So, well, what are you going to do with how can you make jokes up about darter? And a fellow named Jim Spots, as we were riding to the first campsite, he said, oh, I've got him. He says, what do you call a darter with a PhD? Smarter darter. What do you call a darter that takes mass transit? Smarter darter. What do you call a darter that dies for its kind? Smarter darter. What do you call a darter that had beans for dinner? Darter. It just goes on and on and on. Anyway, let's see here. I love rivers. I grew up about a mile from the Chattahoochee back in the 70s and early 80s. And that's where I learned to love rivers. And the story that I always tell about loving rivers is I grew up in a time, if any of y'all remember the Ramblin raft race on the Chattahoochee, that was the place to be and the place to go in Atlanta at the time. I was, 10 to 13 during that era. And if you went to the place called the Diving Rock, if a woman got up on the diving rock, what would all the people down at the bottom say when a woman got up on the diving rock? Take it off, take it off. And invariably, back in those days, they would. And a 12-year-old boy at that time, rivers were great, a great place to be. But one of the things I've learned as doing research on these rivers is if you kind of dig into the sand and the cobble and the mud, you will find our stories, because rivers, as y'all learned in that first the presentation we just heard, civilizations grew up along our rivers. So you have evidence along our rivers in the fish weirs that were built by Native Americans, the mounds that are along the banks of the rivers. They lived along these rivers because all that the rivers did for them. And when we first settled Georgia, 1733, by 1800, the 3 most populated towns in the state were Savannah, Augusta, and Petersburg. No coincidence that they were all along the main stem of the Savannah River. Petersburg, of course, we know Augusta and Savannah. Has anybody heard of Petersburg before? No, it was a tobacco outlet at the mouth where the Broad River and the Savannah River came together. And it was the third largest town in Georgia in 1800. Our towns, our cities grew up because of the connection to the rivers, and that's how we first explored this state, was paddling up the rivers. This is Kit Carson right there. I threw this little slide in. We are still dependent upon our rivers today. We don't really recognize it all the time, but we are still very dependent upon our rivers today. We use them for drinking water, of course. They carry away our waste. We have industries that use the water to make products like paper. But we also, one of the biggest ways that we use our rivers is for power, for electricity. This is a shot of the Plant Vogtle down on the Savannah. And they have 2 new nuclear reactors right there, the biggest power producer in the state. They can't produce that electricity without the water from the Savannah River. So we are still very dependent upon our rivers. This is the diving rock at the 𝘎𝘪𝘷𝘦𝘳 that I mentioned, the place where I first learned to love rivers. And when I go back home, I grew up in Cobb County where the landscape has changed dramatically. You go back and you don't recognize, the place where you grew up. But one thing that's always has been constant is the river. It is always kind of unchanging. And when I think about home, I don't necessarily think about the land that I grew up on, the suburb, the house that I grew up in. I think about the 𝘎𝘪𝘷𝘦 River because it is unchanging. And I think that's one of the interesting things about rivers is that they are unchanging, but at the same time, they're always changing, right? You never step in the same river twice. These, in my research that I've done on these guidebooks, I get the old U.S. Army Corps of Engineers maps from the archives, from the National Archives. And this is a map from 1890. And I don't know if you can see, but there's 2 big oxbows here. This is the 𝘬𝘴𝘦𝘳 River coming into the Savannah River. And this is current aerial map. This oxbow right here kind of still exists, but the river has cut a whole new course through there. So rivers are unchanging, but they're always changing. We heard in the last presentation a little bit about the rice plantation culture of the Georgia coast. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I know we're in a room full of historians. I asked my niece and nephew this question this morning. What are the 4 things? What are the 4 things that were prohibited in the colony of Georgia from the get-go?
Slavery.
Slavery is one of them. Lawyers. Alcohol. And Catholics. Well, when the lawyers went on the Catholics, we're not going to. It was designed to be kind of a common man's utopia. They also had rules about owning large tracts of land. You could only own a small tract of land. But over in South Carolina, you had those wealthy plantation owners that were already using slave labor to transform the islands along the coast into these rice plantations that generated incredible wealth. And those South Carolinians looked across the Savannah River and they saw the islands in the Savannah River and the mouth of the 𝘬𝘴𝘦𝘳 River and the mouth of the 𝘬𝘴𝘠 River. And they said, we can make a killing over there. And that's what they did. They moved in, and by 1750, we had slavery. So to give y'all an idea, I don't know if any of y'all have ever spent time on any of the barrier islands or any of the islands in the deltas of these rivers, but they are unforgiving places. They are filled with mosquitoes. It's just, some of the conditions are unbearable there. And that's, you had to use forced labor. Nobody would willingly work in these fields. But to give you an idea of what life was like on these plantations, I ran across excerpt from Fanny Kimball's Journal of Residence on a Georgia plantation, which many of y'all are probably familiar with. Fanny Kimball was a English actress that married a plantation owner, Mr. Butler. And for a brief time, they came down and actually lived on Butler Island. And she described Butler Island this way. It would be difficult to define it by either the name of land or water, for 'tis neither liquid nor solid, but kind of a mud sponge floating on the bosom of the 𝘬𝘴𝘦𝘳 River. The product of this delectable spot is rice, oranges, negroes, fleas, mosquitoes, various beautiful evergreens, sundry sorts of snakes, alligators, and bulrushes, enough to have made cradles not for Moses alone, but for the whole Israelitish host besides. It was an unforgiving place, and Fanny Kimball wrote a lot about the treatment of the slaves there. Her journal was kind of instrumental in the abolitionist movement. Of course, Civil War, 1860, 1865. Slavery was done away with. In 1878, a man named Nathaniel Bishop, I don't know if y'all have ever heard of Nathaniel Bishop, but he was an intrepid explorer in the 1800s, late 1800s. And in the 1870s, he got in a 50-pound boat, basically a small canoe, and he traveled from the St. Lawrence Seaway all the way down the Atlantic coast, across to the 𝘎𝘴𝘦 River, and finished his trip at the Gulf of Mexico along the 𝘎𝘴𝘦 River. And his journal recounts his encounters on the Georgia coast. And he stopped at Broughton Island, which is another island in the 𝘬𝘴𝘦 River Delta, which was cultivated for rice. And this is what he said about his visit on Broughton Island in 1878, again, a decade after the emancipation of the enslaved. He said, witnessing the workings of the plantation and the, quote, freedmen who now work the rice fields for wages, he noted that the operator of the plantation was, quote, a thorough disciplinarian, and that, quote, the Negroes stuck to him with greater tenacity than they did to those planters who allowed them to do as they pleased. So in other words, not much had changed for those people that were enslaved that lived on those rice plantation islands 10 years after the end of the Civil War. So I want to bring you then to another thing that was mentioned in the last presentation, and that was Field Order number 15, which was issued by General Sherman in January of 1865. Any of y'all know about how that field order came to be? Y'all heard this story. It arose because of the geology of Georgia and the streams in Georgia. Talk about how streams have shaped our culture and our history. Well, this is a perfect example. There's a place just north of Savannah. It's a tributary of the Savannah called Ebenezer Creek. You go there today, it is one of the most beautiful paddles it could ever take. There are cypress in that creek that are thousands of years old. The old Augusta Road that ran from Savannah to Augusta went across Ebenezer Creek and through the Ebenezer Creek swamp. And in 1864, after Sherman had captured Atlanta, he then moved towards Savannah in November, December of 64, and he split his army into several wings. One wing went east towards Augusta, then south, kind of paralleling the Savannah River and following that old Augusta Road. And as they went, they were living off the land, and they were emancipating slaves as they went, and the slaves were following, and they came to be known as camp followers. And so the camp followers followed this wing of the army down to Ebenezer Creek. The Confederates, of course, had burned the bridge over the creek. So the Union Army brought in the engineers and they built a pontoon bridge across Ebenezer Creek. 14,000 men crossed the creek, and then the camp followers. But before the camp followers could start crossing the creek, they removed the pontoons and left the camp followers on the north side of Ebenezer Creek with the Confederate cavalry closing in. At the time, it was December, so it was cold. The creek was rain swollen. It was flooded. And in a panic, they don't know how many of the camp followers did this, but there were hundreds, some accounts say thousands, tried to cross this creek during early December, cold, wet, and many, many perished. And the Union soldiers that were on the south side watched this happen. Many of them tried to help these formerly enslaved people try to get across the river or get across the creek. But these soldiers were incensed at what they saw. And so they wrote letters back north. Those letters ended up in northern newspapers. It got around to Congress, and there was an outcry. It was essentially kind of the George Floyd video in our era. It was the same thing in 1864. And so there was intense political pressure on President Lincoln to do something about this. They're supposed to be emancipating these slaves, not killing them. And in their actions, they have led to the massacre of, perhaps hundreds of former slaves. And so Abraham Lincoln sent Edward Stanton down to Savannah and said, you got to do something about this. So Stanton and Sherman met with, I believe it was 20 black leaders in Savannah, mostly preachers, which is kind of an unusual event at that time. And they asked them, after this war, what do you need? And they said, we want land. And more than that, we want land separate from the white people because we don't trust them. And so that's where Field Order 15 came about. That's how it came about, because of this incident on Ebenezer Creek. And of course, Field Order 15 was issued. It set aside about 400,000 acres from Charleston, South Carolina, down to Jacksonville, Florida, along the coast that was going to be set aside for blacks. Many of them moved on to this land called Sherman's Land. But of course, Lincoln was killed that spring. By the fall of 1865, that field order was rescinded and ended that program. Think how things might have been different if that field order had stayed in place. But it all started right here on Ebenezer Creek. And we did this trip on Ebenezer Creek about 4 weeks ago. And you can actually go and stand on that raised causeway through the swamp. Stand on the very spot where these camp followers chose to get into that stream and try to cross that stream to get to the other side to save their lives. You can stand on that spot. It's a moving place to go there. It's also a beautiful paddle. Our rivers are still shaping our culture, our economy. The Port of Savannah is probably the biggest economic engine in the state. When Oglethorpe came to 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Bluff in 1733, how deep was the port at Savannah? 10 feet. How deep is the port now? 47 feet. Over the past 200 years, we have dredged, we have widened, we have engineered the Savannah Harbor so that we can get these huge ships into the port. And so it continues to shape our economy, and it continues to shape our culture. The other thing that's interesting about rivers is, and y'all can be honest about this, how many of y'all have ever gone to a river to do something you didn't want anybody to know about? Anybody ever gone down to the river or the creek to make out with a boyfriend or girlfriend? Nobody? Nobody?
We used our horse and wagons.
I know I did. But you go to the river a lot of times to do things you don't want anybody to know about because it's a secluded place. It's a wild place. And you also have the river to get rid of any evidence, right? So in all the research that I've done on these books and on rivers, you name a river, I can name you a murder, a massacre, a lynching that took place by that river. Because we do things along rivers that we don't want anybody to know about. One of the most horrific incidents took place, y'all are you're up in Lawrenceville on the Yellow River, but one of the most horrific incidents took place on the South Yellow and 𝘬𝘴𝘦𝘳 rivers in the Newton and is it Jasper County? Yeah, Newton and Jasper County. In 1921, in Georgia, we still had basically what we had debt slavery. And one of the ways that this worked is if a black man was arrested, he was in jail until he paid his fine. He couldn't pay his fine. So what people would do is they would come in and I'm going to pay a fine for you. You will come work for me until you pay off that fine. And a man down in near Monticello was using this very form of labor, John Williams. It was illegal, but it was commonplace in Georgia, even in 1920s. Word got to federal investigators. The federal investigators came down to John Williams' farm, and they began asking questions. And John Williams got nervous, and as he got nervous, he proceeded to get his foreman, who was a black man, to systematically murder 12 of his workers so he could cover up the debt slavery that he was doing. And the way he killed 5 of them was he put them in a car, he put chains around their necks, tied rocks in bags to those chains, tied their hands, took them to a bridge over the Yellow River, and forced 2 of them over the bridge into the river. There was another one in the car that night. His name was his last name was Price. And he got to this bridge here, which is Man's Bridge over the South River. And he had seen what happened to the other 2. And they forced him out of the car. And he said, this was all in the court hearings. He says, "Don't throw me over, I'll get over." He paused and muttered, "Lord have mercy," before leaning over the edge and plunging to his death. The reason that John Williams chose these locations is because they had just built 𝘬𝘴𝘦𝘳 Dam on the 𝘬𝘴𝘦 River, and it had backed up Lake Jackson. And so he thought this would be a good place to hide his deeds. Of course, the bodies were found. John Williams and Clyde Manning, who was his overseer, were both convicted. And it was the first time that a white man had been convicted of the murder of a black man in Georgia history. And it didn't happen again until 1961. But that is the story of John Williams on the South Yellow and 𝘬𝘴𝘦 rivers. One of the interesting things that I found about this, and one of the most telling things, was that before the trial, a pastor from Monticello who knew Mr. Williams wrote into the Atlanta Constitution a letter about this incident. Remember, this is a pastor, and it speaks to the culture of that time. He didn't defend Williams, but he said that Williams would, quote, "get a fair and impartial trial by a set of 12 men of the old Anglo-Saxon strain of blood, unmixed by any foreign element whatsoever, and I know of no better people on earth. So that's the story of John Williams. Am I bringing y'all down here? I'm going to skip over that. So the first people that traveled our streams, of course, rather other than the Native Americans, were pole boats. If you can imagine poling a boat from Milledgeville or Macon all the way down to Darien on the coast, poling it down, not a big problem. You got the current. But then they actually poled the boats back upstream, all the way upstream. So that was quite a chore. And that was how goods were moved up and down rivers to the coast in the 1800s. And one of the interesting things about the history of our use of our rivers is, as we talked about originally, the rivers were the path into Georgia. That's how we settled Georgia. And as we began to settle the interior of Georgia, it was critical that our rivers and streams remain open for boat passage, right? Because that's, if you lived up on the Broad River, how were you going to get your goods to market? There was really no road, very few roads. So the rivers and the creeks, even the small creeks, were our highways. They were our original highways. So if you look back on laws passed by the General Assembly back in the 1800s, you will see that there was an intent to keep the rivers and streams open for passage and for boats. And even on some streams, if they were used for passage, there were laws passed that required landowners along those streams to actively remove any debris or trees that had fallen in the stream to keep those streams open for boat passage. So you were required to do that by the Georgia General Assembly in the 1800s if you lived along certain streams. When they approved grants for mill dams, those grants were issued with the provision that those streams, a portion of the stream, would be open for passage of boats and fish. The fish were important because you had migratory fish that served as subsistence food for people in the interior. After the Civil War, however, the economy was in shambles. And so the Georgia General Assembly was like, name us a project. It doesn't matter if you have to dam up a river. We'll approve it. We need to industrialize. And so that's what you see in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. Any project that came before the General Assembly that would utilize our rivers to grow industry in Georgia was approved. There was a project, Rome, Georgia. There was a project approved to create a cross-state canal starting in Rome, connecting to the 𝘬𝘴𝘦, from there connecting to the Chattahoochee Basin, and then from the Chattahoochee Basin over into the 𝘎𝘴𝘦 Basin, across state canal using those rivers to get a water passage from Rome all the way to the Georgia coast. There was another proposal to divert the Chattahoochee north of Atlanta into in-town Atlanta to power mills. That was approved. So during the 1880s, 1890s, you see all these projects being approved just to industrialize and diversify the economy. Any dam was a good dam. And then in the early 1900s, as hydropower generating electricity became a thing, then the General Assembly tried to do things to make it easier for entities to build dams. So streams that were previously had been deemed navigable were deemed non-navigable, because if it was a non-navigable stream, then there were fewer hoops to jump through to build the dam. One thing that they did not bend on, while they were progressive in their ideas about utilizing our rivers, they remained very conservative in other ways. There was a law passed in the late 1800s about bathing in the 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 River by Riverside Cemetery in Macon. The law said, quote, any person who shall bathe in the 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 River or other water adjacent to Riverside Cemetery, the county of Bibb, or expose his naked body in view of said cemetery shall be guilty of a misdemeanor. So no nude bathing in the 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 River there in Macon. Hydropower really predominated in the early 1900s. Today, there's an estimated 4,600 dams in Georgia. There are no natural lakes in Georgia except for Banks Lake down near Valdosta. So what you see is the General Assembly passing laws to facilitate what they felt were the highest and best use of the streams at that particular time in history. In the mid-1900s, we had a lot of industry coming into the state, a lot of paper mills that utilize our rivers and discharge their effluent to our rivers. And you started seeing conflicts between industry and commercial fishermen. And the idea at the time was you could have industry and high-paying jobs, these jobs that never existed in Georgia before, or you could have a healthy fishery, but you couldn't have both. This was a headline in 1950 in the Atlanta Constitution. Mills hard on finny ones, payrolls versus fish up for Georgia debate. Fish or factories? That question threatened today to stumble the march of millions of dollars of new industries into Georgia and the South. That was the attitude at the time. You couldn't have both. Our first water pollution laws were passed in the 1950s. They had no teeth in them. And then they got a little stronger in the 1960s. Finally, in 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed, and industries began cleaning up their effluent. And now we know we can't have both. We can have industry that cleans up their effluent, and we can have healthy fisheries. So we've come a long way. Now, how are our rivers used? We talked about rivers being used for power, Plant Vogel. They're used for wastewater. They're used for industry. But one thing they're not used for anymore, remember in the 1800s, they were our superhighways, right? Today, there is no commercial navigation on any inland Georgia rivers. None. Not a bit, even though we spent millions of dollars trying to make our inland rivers navigable for big barges. We don't have any commercial traffic on any of our rivers except there at the Savannah Harbor. But what we do have is about 70 outfitters around the state that operate canoe, kayak, tube, raft vendors on our rivers. That is the commerce that's taking place on our rivers today. But what we've seen is conflicts between riparian property owners, people that own river and streamfront land, and recreational boaters. And the question is, does a recreational boater have a right to float down a stream for which the stream bed is privately owned? And Georgia's law says that on non-navigable streams, a property owner owns the stream bed. On navigable streams, the state owns the stream bed. So what is a navigable stream, according to state law? Navigable stream, according to state law, is a stream that is capable of floating a boat loaded with freight for all or a portion of the year. Okay, that's the definition of navigable in Georgia. And that dates to 1863. Does that mean that the stream has to be capable of floating a steamboat loaded with bales of cotton? Or does it mean it could be a canoe loaded with beaver and deer pelts? Both of those type vessels would have been used on our streams in 1860. So what is the definition of navigable? What does that exactly mean? We don't really know. The issue came to a head back in the 1990s on a place called 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek. How many of y'all have heard of 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek before? Very few people. It's a stream, beautiful stream, down in Baker County in southwest Georgia. It flows through Robert Woodruff's old quail hunting plantation, a place now called the Jones Ecological Research Center. Jones Ecological Research Center was set up after Robert Woodruff died back in the mid-'80s. And it does incredible work down there studying the flora and fauna of the area, studying water resources in the area. They do great work. But when they formed, they decided that they didn't want boaters coming down 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek. And so they put up signs at all the road crossings where the people access the creek. And they said, boating and fishing is no longer allowed on 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek as this creek flows through the Jones Center. A local man by the name of 𝘎𝘪𝘷𝘦𝘳, he was a contractor. He had grown up in Baker County, had a 7th grade education, but had grown up fishing 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek, and that pissed him off. And he said, I'm not going to let this happen. So he organized protests to prevent the Jones Center from closing 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek. The first thing he did was host a bunch of paddlers, had about 30 canoeists and kayakers come down 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek. They arrested many of them, hauled them off to Baker County Jail. And then a few months later, I love this, he organized the 𝘎𝘴 Coke Party, kind of like the Boston Tea Party. But instead of tea, they all opened up cans of Coca-Cola, got on the bridge and poured the Coca-Cola into 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek. Robert Woodruff, it was his plantation. Y'all know who Robert Woodruff is. He was the chair of the CEO of Coca-Cola. So this was symbolic of the little man saying, hey, this ain't fair. We've been using the stream our whole lives, and now you're shutting it down on us. So it was the 𝘎𝘴 Coke Party. And he prophetically said at that protest, he said, if we don't do something, they're going to shut down streams all over the state. That was in the early 90s. The final thing he did was he organized what he came to be known as the goat float. He and a couple of his buddies built this raft you see here, about 4.5 feet by 16 foot. They loaded it with a bale of cotton and a goat and two other guys, the three of them, and they floated down 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek to prove that this stream was navigable. And in fact, if you go back in the history books, the General Assembly passed laws specifically addressing the navigability of 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek and improving the navigability of 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek. It was clearly used in the 1800s to move goods down the creek onto the Flint River and down to Apalachicola on the Gulf Coast. So it was clearly, by the state's definition, a navigable stream. And he set out to prove it with this goat float. He was arrested. The cases wound their way through the court system and ultimately went before the Georgia Supreme Court. And the question was, is 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek navigable? And the justices, despite 𝘎𝘪𝘷𝘦𝘳's illustration of it being navigable, determined that it was not navigable because you couldn't put a modern day barge, which is what, 30-something feet wide, 125 feet long, drafted about 7 feet. You couldn't put a modern day barge down 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek. That was the Supreme Court's, that was the evidence that was presented in the lower courts, and that's what the Supreme Court basically ruled on. And so they ruled against 𝘎𝘪𝘷𝘦, and they declared 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek non-navigable. And that case has kind of been used as the seminal boating passage case here in Georgia for the last 30 years. And basically what it said is, on a non-navigable stream, whatever that is, If you own both sides of a stream, then you have the right as a property owner along that stream to close that stream to the public, and nobody can float down it in a boat. Now, I've asked a lot of lawyers about this case, and they will tell you, well, look who was involved in this case. You had the most influential, most powerful, most wealthy family in the state on one side, and on the other side, you had a local sportsman with a 7th grade education. Who's going to win that court battle? This was a foregone conclusion, this particular case. Attorneys will tell me that, but they won't say it publicly. So I went to talk to Norman Fletcher, who was former Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court. He was the dissenting voice in this case. Two justices dissented in this ruling, and he was one of them. And I asked him, I said, what is it about this case? What was wrong with it? He said, the reason that 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 lost is because he didn't have the resources to present the right evidence to the courts, and because of who held the purse strings. So this case today is being used to shut down streams to the public all over our state. And we're seeing eroding of the number of places that recreational boaters can paddle and fish. And that's a big problem. It's a big problem because though our streams are not used for commercial navigation anymore, they are used for commerce. It's a big part of our record-setting tourism economy here in Georgia. Like I said, you got 70 outfitters that operate on our streams. We have people that come to Georgia specifically for outdoor recreation. And what our laws say is you're not welcome on our streams. I talked to a kayaking canoe club down in Tallahassee, Florida last month. And I asked them, I said, do y'all do trips in Georgia? And they said, no, generally we don't go to Georgia because one, we're afraid we're going to get harassed by property owners, or two, we're afraid we're going to get arrested. They actually have had members of their club arrested. They were actually arrested on 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Creek back in the 90s. So they don't come to Georgia to paddle because they're not really sure where they can legally paddle. So it's a big problem. It's a problem that we're working on. But it's just a continuation of decisions that our state leaders have to make about what is the highest and best use of our streams today. Is it the highest and best use to make them private so that property owners can have that privacy and use the streams as they wish? Or is it in the best interest of everyone for those streams to be open and accessible to the public and people have the right to pass down them in boats? So that's a big debate that we are working on with our state leaders right now. And again, part of the continuing history of how we use our rivers and how we've used our rivers throughout history. So with that, do y'all have any questions? I put y'all to sleep at the end of a long day of listening to folks yap. All right.
Got a stupid question.
All right. What is your question?
How does that old boat work? I mean, they just got these two long things with a, how does it get down? I
The
mean,
whole boats?
I can understand getting down, but how do they get up?
Well, they had a crew, usually a crew of like six men, and they would all work in unison to push the boat upstream. It was usually enslaved folks that were doing that work.
You also use horses or mules alongside.
You could do that, yeah. In places you could
Oh,
put it up. That's how the 𝘎𝘴𝘦𝘳 Savannah Canal worked. Yes,
Is it equivalent to the keel boats?
I'm not familiar with the keel boats.
That's where they use the poles and also oars and ropes,
Yeah,
like the Lewis and Clark expedition
Yes.
going up the Missouri River.
it would have been the same techniques. Same techniques.
Now, the keel boat may have had a keel, and these are flat, maybe.
Probably use both, I would bet, depending on who built them.
What's the prognosis for the freedom to float?
We've been calling it our Freedom to Float initiative. There is a very strong group of property rights legislators who think that allowing somebody to pass through a stream through your property is trespassing on your property. And they read the law to say that on a non-navigable stream, a property owner owns the entire stream bed, therefore they can exclude people just as you would exclude people from your land. We argue that Georgia's statutory and common law history points to the fact that we actually have a right of passage, a public easement down any stream that's capable of floating a boat. So our challenge is convincing Georgia legislators that this right of passage exists on all streams that are capable of floating boats, even streams that are privately owned.
And where are we in that challenge?
We are trying to get legislation introduced.
Okay.
Yes,
Does it matter if it's like the same owner on each side of the waterway? Like if, or someone owns, the east side of the South River and someone owns the west side, but they both together decide that I don't want anybody on my half the middle of the river. You don't want anybody on your, is that?
yes. If two property owners that own both sides separately go together and say, we don't want anybody passing down here, it would be the same as one property owner that owns both sides of the stream. But if my neighbor on the opposite side of the stream doesn't want to prohibit people from passing down, then I'm out of luck because I only own to the middle of the stream. So it's kind of strange, but that's the way a lot of legislators are choosing to interpret the law as it is. It's a very vague and ambiguous definition of navigable. And it also impacts where people have the right to hunt and fish. So you can hunt and fish on any navigable stream, but on a non-navigable stream, those hunting and fishing rights go with who owns the property. So on a non-navigable stream, you can prohibit people from fishing or hunting there. But again, what's a navigable stream? What's a non-navigable stream? There's no clear definition.
Isn't that the real challenge, is trying to determine what's navigable and what's not?
Yes.
And that's where, and that's hung up in the legislature right now?
No, they have chosen just to not address it.
Oh,
They did a study committee this last session, and basically they said, we're not going to change any laws. We're going to leave it as is. It seems to be working. And they're allowing conflicts to resolve themselves either in courts or, at the local level.
so it's a case by case basis,
Are the owners concerned about the people landing and walking around on their property?
Yeah, the question was, are property owners concerned about people trespassing? Yes, because people trespass, it's like, a couple of bad apples spoil the whole pot, right? So if you have one or two people that go on somebody's property and litter or start a campfire and, leave a campfire ring or, do whatever, then makes a bad impression, as they don't want anybody coming down there. And that's what a lot of the legislators that are property rights legislators, that's what they tell us. And I tell them, well, you have roads that go down in front of people's houses. A few people litter along those roads. That doesn't mean we're going to close down the roads, right? So it's an interesting debate. Yes, ma'am.
Do other states have those laws, or some states have freedom on the rivers?
That's a very good question. So the question was, what do other states do? Our neighboring states have policy in place that is essentially what we would like to see happen here in Georgia, which is if a stream is capable of floating a recreational watercraft, then you have the right to pass down it. You don't have the right to get out on anybody's property as you're going down, but you have the right to pass down it. That's the policy in Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Tennessee. We don't care about what Alabama does. It's Alabama. But that is the policy in our neighboring states except for Alabama. And so in that respect, we are at a competitive disadvantage with those other states as far as generating outdoor recreation tourism. Yes.
Places like Helen down the 𝘎𝘪𝘥𝘦 River where there's multiple people own all that property. Do they just have an agreement that it's okay for those two rafting companies to come down the river?
Yeah, that is, again, is that a navigable stream? Some people would say yes, some people would say no.
Depends on if it's high stream or I have walked down it before.
Yeah, you can walk.
That's
So that's been the tradition there so long.
mhm.
Anybody that owns property through
Yes.
Helen
Yeah.
knows that you're gonna have thousands of tubers coming down there. And so, and that's such a huge part of the tourism economy out there, they're not gonna mess with that. But just downstream in the Saltine 𝘕𝘴𝘦 Valley, Jimmy Harris has 𝘎𝘴𝘦 Outfitters, and he prohibits people from passing down part of the river through 𝘎𝘴𝘦, for the 𝘕𝘴𝘦 Valley, because he uses it for trout fishing. And he wants to keep that a private stream, so he can do that. And that's a very legitimate use. And I think those uses should be protected as well. But again, that's a stream that people have paddled traditionally for decades, but now they can't because he's saying you can't pass down here.
Well, they have to catch you though, right?
Well, that's the way it is with breaking all laws, right?
That's
To
right.
catch you. Yes, sir.
How about panning for gold?
I think that is, you would need to get permission from the property owner on a non-navigable stream, because that's a taking just like a fishing and hunting. But there's a lot of that up on the Chesapeake and the upper Etowah and. All right, well, thank you for letting me yap at y'all at the end of the day. If y'all have any questions, be around and be happy to answer them. If you want to get a book, we have books up here for sale, the user guide books. And come paddle with us on a river trip sometime. We have some really fun times. We do day trips, weekend trips where we're doing 2 days and camping. And then we do our week-long trip each summer that is a real blast.
Kayak or
Canoe, kayak, paddleboard, any non-motorized vessel. So thank you.